My daughter handed me an eviction notice at my own kitchen table, not a metaphorical one, an actual legal document printed on white paper with my name on it as the party required to vacate. I sat there holding it for a long moment, staring at the words without really reading them. The kitchen smelled like the coffee I'd just made. The same kitchen I'd remodeled with my own hands 15 years ago. The same table where my wife Miriam had sat every morning for 32 years. And my daughter Paige, 34 years old, stood across from me with her arms crossed and her husband Derek just behind her like a shadow. "You have 30 days, Paige said. We've already talked to a lawyer." I'm 67 years old. I spent 4 decades as a high school history teacher in Dayton, Ohio. I coached JV baseball for 12 of those years. I'm not a dramatic man. I don't make scenes. So I set the paper down on the table, picked up my coffee mug, and said, "I see." That was it. That was the whole conversation. What I didn't say, what I couldn't say, because my throat had closed up entirely, was that the house they were handing me papers for was mine. Purchased in 1991, mortgage paid off in 2018, named on the deed as sole owner since Miriam passed 2 years ago. My name, my house, my kitchen table. I need to back up. Miriam died in March of 2022, pancreatic cancer. She was diagnosed in November and gone by spring, which is how that disease works. It doesn't give you much time to argue with it. We had 34 years together, and I won't pretend the last 2 without her have been anything but hard. The house felt too big. The silences felt wrong. I rattled around in 5 rooms like a marble in a shoebox. Paige had suggested, about 8 months after the funeral, that she and Derek move in. "Just to help out, Dad," she said. "Derek can handle the yard. I can make sure you're eating right. You shouldn't be alone in that big place." I thought it was a kindness. I thought it was my daughter looking after me. I was wrong about that, though I didn't know it yet. Derek had lost his job the previous year, something vague about a restructuring at the logistics company where he'd worked. Paige was a dental hygienist, made decent money, but they'd been renting an apartment in Kettering that was eating up more than they liked. Moving in with me solved 2 problems for them, while appearing to solve 1 problem for me. I didn't see it that way at the time. I was grieving and lonely, and I said yes. For the first 6 months, it was fine, more or less. Derek fixed the gutter I'd been ignoring. Paige cooked on Sundays. We watched football. It felt for a little while like family. Then Derek started talking about the long term. He brought it up one evening in October. The 3 of us at dinner, pot roast, the kind of ordinary night that shouldn't contain anything sharp. He said he'd been thinking about what made sense financially. Said the house was a significant asset. Said it might be worth having a conversation about how it was structured. I wasn't sure what he meant, and I said so. He was ready for that. He had a whole quiet speech prepared about estate planning, about probate, about how complicated things could get if something happened to me and the house had to go through the courts. He mentioned a lawyer he knew. He mentioned something called a transfer on death deed, which he said was simpler than a will, just a formality really, just a way to make sure everything went smoothly. I'm a history teacher. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm also not an idiot. And something about the way Derek spoke, too smooth, too rehearsed, like he'd practiced it, made me feel the way I used to feel when a student handed in a paper that was slightly too good for who they were. I said I'd think about it. He brought it up again in November, then in December, each time with more urgency, new angles. Paige started joining in, gently at first, then less gently. The word "dad" started appearing in her sentences in a way that sounded like punctuation rather than affection. In January, I made an appointment with my own lawyer, a woman named Patricia Oakes, who had handled Miriam's estate and who I trusted completely. I told her everything Derek had suggested. She listened without expression, and when I finished, she said, "Don't sign anything. Not yet. Let me look into something. She called me back 4 days later. What Patricia had found was this. Derek had, without my knowledge, contacted the title company the previous fall. He'd requested information about the property, my property, including an inquiry about whether there were any existing liens or encumbrances. He'd also spoken to a real estate attorney in Columbus, describing himself in those communications as the property manager of my home. He had not told me any of this. Patricia's voice was careful, and even when she explained it, "He hasn't done anything illegal yet," she said, "but he's laying groundwork, and the fact that he's describing himself as property manager is something we should address immediately." I drove home from her office and sat in my car in the driveway for a while. The house looked the same as it always had. White aluminum siding, black shutters, the oak tree in the front yard that Miriam had planted the year we moved in. I thought about her planting that tree. She'd been so certain it would get too big for the yard eventually. 30 years later, she'd been right. I didn't say anything to Paige or Derek that evening, or the next day. I needed to think clearly, and I've learned over 6 decades that anger is the enemy of clear thinking. Patricia sent Derek a certified letter the following week. It was polite but explicit. She represented me in all matters related to the property at my address. Any communications regarding the property should go through her office, and any suggestion that Derek held any managerial or ownership interest in the property was factually and legally incorrect. I was upstairs when the mail arrived. I heard Derek read it. I heard him say something to Paige in a low voice I couldn't make out. I heard the silence that followed. That evening, Paige knocked on my bedroom door. She didn't come in, just stood in the doorway, and her face had an expression I didn't recognize at first. It took me a moment to identify it as calculation. Not anger. Calculation. "Derek thinks you don't trust us," she said. "Derek communicated with the title company about my home without telling me," I said. "That's not about trust, that's about facts." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "We're going to need to rethink this arrangement," and walked away. I didn't sleep much that night. The eviction notice came 3 weeks later. They'd had it drawn up by an attorney and it was formatted correctly and everything. The argument, as laid out in the document, was that I had verbally agreed to transfer management of the property to Derek, and that his subsequent actions as property manager constituted a legal interest. It was, Patricia told me when I brought it in, completely without merit, legally absurd, actually. But it was designed to frighten me, to make me feel like I was on uncertain ground in my own home. And I won't lie, sitting at that table holding that paper for about 45 seconds it worked. I felt the ground shift slightly under my feet. Then I folded the notice in half and put it in my coat pocket and went to call Patricia. She told me to stay in the house. "Do not leave voluntarily," she said, "because voluntary departure complicates things unnecessarily." She would respond formally, and if necessary, we would pursue a harassment claim, and I could look into whether Derek's misrepresentation of himself as property manager to a third party constituted fraud. I went back to my daily life. I made my coffee. I took my walks. I read. Derek and Paige moved around me like I was furniture, not hostile exactly, just present in the way of people who have decided you are an obstacle. In early March, I was going through a closet in the bedroom. Miriam sighed, which I hadn't properly gone through since she died. It was overdue. I knew that. I'd been avoiding it the way you avoid things that are going to cost you something emotionally. I found her winter coats first, then shoe boxes of photographs from before we were married. Then, tucked into the back corner behind a stack of sweaters, a metal lockbox I had never seen before. It was small, the size of a hardcover book, with a combination lock. I didn't know the combination. I sat on the edge of the bed with it for a long time. Miriam had kept things private sometimes, not secretively, just in the way of a person who liked having some things that were entirely her own. I had respected that. We both had our spaces. But I'd never known about this box. I tried our anniversary, nothing. I tried her birthday, nothing. I tried the year we met. It opened. Inside was a folded letter in her handwriting, a small key, and a card from a credit union I didn't recognize. Lakewood Community Federal Credit Union, with a Miriam's name on it. I read her letter sitting there on the edge of the bed, with the winter afternoon light coming through the curtains. She had opened the account in 2019, she wrote. She'd done it quietly because she'd wanted it to be something she handled herself, something that was her contribution to the future, specifically to my future after her. She had been putting money aside for years, not large amounts, just consistent ones. Birthday money from her mother, the part of her substitute teaching income that she'd never mentioned, a small inheritance from an uncle she barely knew that had come in 2015 and that she'd never spent. She wrote that she loved me and that she knew I would be stubborn about being taken care of, and that she was sorry she couldn't be there to argue with me about it. She wrote that she hoped I would use it to live well, whatever that looked like. I sat on the bed for a long time after I finished reading. Then I drove to the Lakewood branch location, which turned out to be 20 minutes away in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and an urgent care. I walked in with the card and the key and Miriam's death certificate, which Patricia had advised me to always keep a copy of in my car after the estate process. The account manager who helped me was a young man named Vincent, maybe 26, with the kind of careful professionalism that young people have when they're trying very hard to do their job correctly. He typed for a while. He looked at the screen. He typed again. Then he looked up at me with an expression that was professional but slightly startled, like a man who has just found something unexpected in a filing cabinet and isn't sure yet what to do with it. "Mr. Aldrich," he said, "I want to make sure I'm reading this correctly." He turned the monitor toward me. The balance was $247,000. I stared at it. I want to tell you I had some profound reaction, some clear, clean emotion. What I actually felt was a buzzing in my ears and the strong sensation that I was sitting in the wrong chair, in the wrong building. "That can't be right," I said. Vincent, to his credit, did not seem offended. He explained calmly and clearly that the account had been opened with a modest initial deposit, but had been set up in a specific type of investment vehicle that Miriam had apparently researched carefully. A low-risk growth account, conservative but compounding over 6 years. She'd added to it 31 separate times. He could show me the statement history if I'd like. I said yes. He printed it. I sat in the chair and read through 31 deposits made by my wife over 6 years, the last one 7 weeks before she died. $40 here, $200 there. A single deposit of $4,800 in 2020 that I later figured out was the substitute teaching money she'd saved over 2 full years. She had been meticulous. She had been patient. She had, in her quiet way, been taking care of me for years before she knew she would need to. I told Vincent I needed a few minutes. He brought me a paper cup of water and left me alone at the little desk, and I sat there and cried, the specific kind of crying that isn't about sadness, exactly, but about recognizing love in a form you weren't expecting. I called Patricia from the parking lot. She was quiet for a moment when I told her the number. Then she said, "Okay, that changes your options considerably." What had changed most immediately was the eviction situation. Patricia's response to the notice had already made the legal position clear. I was the sole owner. There was no valid claim. Derek had no standing. But the financial cushion meant I had the resources to pursue this aggressively and for as long as it took if they wanted to push it. It also meant that if Derek and Paige chose to make things difficult, I had the ability to consult a second attorney, hire specialists, and in the worst case, have them removed through a formal unlawful detainer process without having to worry about the cost. It also meant something else I'd been quietly worrying about. I'd retired at 65 on a teacher's pension, which was enough to live on but didn't leave much room for surprises. The prospect of a legal fight, of hotel stays if I'd had to leave, of rebuilding somewhere else. I hadn't let myself look at that prospect straight on. Now I could. Patricia sent a second letter to Derek and Paige's attorney that week, this one considerably less polite than the first. It laid out, in clear legal language, that I was the sole owner of the property, that they were residing there under an informal and revocable arrangement, that the eviction notice they had served had no legal validity, and that continued interference with my property rights or any further attempts to misrepresent Derek's relationship to the property would result in both civil and potentially criminal action. She also noted that I was prepared, if they preferred, to begin formal eviction proceedings against them. I don't know which part of that letter did it, but 3 days after it was delivered, Derek came and knocked on my office door. He looked like a man who had slept badly for a week. He said he thought they'd gotten things confused, that there had been a miscommunication, that he hoped we could put it behind us. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about Miriam's letter. I thought about Patricia telling me he hasn't done anything illegal yet. I thought about my daughter standing in the doorway of my room with that calculating look. I want you both out within 60 days, I said. I'll draw up the agreement with my attorney so there's no confusion about the terms. He blinked. Paige is your daughter. I know who Paige is, I said. 60 days. They left in 43. I didn't help them move, but I didn't make it difficult either. The morning they loaded the last boxes into Derek's truck, Paige stood at the front door for a moment, looking at me across the entryway. I hope you know you're going to regret this, she said. I didn't answer that. There wasn't much to say. I spent 2 weeks after they left just being alone in the house, which sounds like it might have been bleak, but wasn't. I cleaned out rooms properly. I fixed the things that had been bothering me since winter. I had Patricia's final invoice paid and thanked her sincerely. I sat at the kitchen table in the mornings and drank my coffee in a silence that felt right rather than wrong for the first time in a long time. Then I called my old colleague from the school, a man named Stu who ran the after-school tutoring program and who had been asking me for 2 years if I'd consider volunteering. He needed somebody who could do one-on-one sessions with struggling sophomores in history and civics. I said I had some time and I'd be glad to help. The first afternoon I was there, a 15-year-old named Marcus, who had been described to me as unmotivated and resistant, spent 20 minutes telling me everything wrong with how the Civil War was taught in textbooks before I could even get a word in. I thought, this kid is going to be fine. Miriam's money stayed mostly where it was. I moved it to an account at my regular bank at Patricia's suggestion, just for administrative simplicity, but I didn't spend it down or do anything dramatic with it. I used some to fix the roof, which had needed it for 2 years. I made a donation to the library where Miriam had volunteered. I set aside a portion in a separate account that I thought of, privately, as the She Thought of Everything fund, money I could use if something unexpected came up, the way she had intended. The oak tree in the front yard leafed out fully that April. It was enormous, the way she'd always said it would be. It took up most of the corner of the yard, more than any reasonable landscaping plan would have allowed for, but I'd never trimmed it back, and I wasn't going to start. Paige called once, in May. I let it go to voicemail. She said she hoped we could talk, that Derek and she had been doing some reflection, that she missed me. I listened to the message twice. I didn't call back that day. I needed more time, not to decide whether I was angry, because that part was straightforward, but to decide what kind of relationship was still possible with a daughter who had stood at my kitchen table and handed me a document designed to remove me from my own home. That kind of damage doesn't unhappen. You don't come back from it to the same place you were before. Maybe you come back to something different, and more careful and more clear-eyed, but you don't come back to before. I called her back 3 weeks later. We talked for 40 minutes. I told her exactly what I thought had happened and exactly how it had made me feel, and I didn't soften it, because I've learned that softening things doesn't help anyone. It just delays the accounting. She cried. I let her. I didn't apologize for any of it. At the end of the call, she asked if she could come by sometime. I said yes, but not yet. Give it a while. She said, "Okay, Dad." And I thought, hearing her say it that way, with something real in it instead of calculation, that maybe we'd get somewhere eventually. Not back to before, but somewhere. That's what I've got for you, for whatever it's worth. I'm 67 years old. I spent 40 years teaching teenagers that history is mostly the story of people making the same mistakes over and over, with occasional exceptions. I thought I knew what those exceptions looked like. Turns out love can be patient in ways you never expected, and so can you. And sometimes those two things meet in a metal lockbox in the back of a closet and change everything you thought you understood about how the rest of your life was going to go. Don't forget to subscribe if stories like this matter to you. And if you got something like this in your own life, a moment where everything shifted, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. You'd be surprised how much company you have. I keep thinking about the oak tree in the front yard. Miriam planted it the year we moved in, and she always said it was going to get too big for that corner. She was right. 30 years later, it takes up more space than any reasonable person would have allowed, and I've never once considered cutting it back. Some things are allowed to grow exactly as far as they're meant to go. That's what I think about when I think about what Paige and Derek tried to do and what happened instead. They had calculated everything except one thing, that the person they were maneuvering against had spent 40 years teaching young people to think carefully before they acted, to read what was in front of them, and to understand that every choice lands somewhere, eventually. What they mistook for an old man's passivity was just patience. What they mistook for vulnerability was a man who had learned over a long life that you don't move until you know where you're moving. Derek laid groundwork. He made phone calls he thought I wouldn't find out about. He described himself as a property manager to a title company, as though saying a thing out loud made it real. That kind of thinking, the idea that you can reshape reality by claiming it before anyone checks, is something I saw in students sometimes. The ones who handed in papers they hadn't written, who thought the problem was getting caught rather than the choice they'd made in the first place. It never ended the way they planned. Not because the universe is a moral machine that punishes the wicked on a schedule, but because that kind of thinking produces bad decisions, and bad decisions accumulate until they collapse under their own weight. What saved me wasn't luck. It was that I'd paid attention when something felt wrong, that I called a lawyer before I signed anything, that I stayed in the house when everything in me wanted to just leave quietly and avoid the conflict. Staying was hard. It required me to look at my daughter clearly, without the softening lens of how much I loved her, and to see what she was actually doing. That's not easy. It might be the hardest thing I've done since Miriam died, but it was necessary. Honoring your own perception of reality, even when someone you love is telling you that perception is wrong. That takes something. And Miriam? I've thought about her every day since I opened that lockbox, but differently now. She knew I would resist being taken care of. She knew I would wave off concern and say I was fine. So she did it quietly, over 6 years, 31 deposits, without ever making it a conversation. That's not just love. That's a kind of intelligence. The understanding that the most useful thing you can give someone isn't always what they ask for, it's what they'll need when they can't ask for anything at all. I'm 67 years old and I'm still learning. What I know now that I didn't fully know before is that integrity isn't just about the big moments. It's the Patricia Oaks you call when something feels wrong. It's the letter you don't ignore. It's the lockbox you eventually open, even though you know it's going to cost you something. It's the phone call you make to your daughter 3 weeks later, honest and clear, without softening it, because the softened version would be easier for both of you. The oak tree grew because nobody stopped it. That's all. Some things just need room and time and someone who doesn't cut them back.